The movie begins introducing us Steve, and he says that he always had the dream of becoming a miner. But the only problem was that a miner prohibited him because it was too dangerous. We go a few years in the future, and Steve is working for a company selling doorknobs. One day he managed to remember what his childhood dream was, and quit his job to finally enter the mine, because the old miner became too slow, and he managed to pass him to explore in the mines, in where we can see that he found two artifacts that had the shape of a cube, and when he put them together, a kind of portal was created that took him to another world. He decided to call it the Overworld, and says it was the most amazing thing that he had ever seen in his life, because in that place he has special abilities, and he can make anything with the help of his imagination. But the only problem is when the night came, because he was always attacked by monstrous creatures. So one day he realized that he needed a friend, and decided to tame a wolf with the help of a bone. Steve always played along with his friend Dennis, and says he liked to build to improve his skills. But one day he found strange ruins, and used his materials to activate the portal. He then ran off to chase his pet, and they ended up being teleported to the Nether, where we can see that the piglins lived, and they were led by the sorceress Malgosha. She had the idea of using the orb of the domain to go to the other dimension, and this way obtain the gold for all her army. So Steve decided that they had to stop her, and that they would steal the cube so that they would not use its power. Then he decided to sacrifice himself so that his pet would escape, and so he would go to Earth to hide the cube in his house. We go to the road, and we are introduced to Garrison. He was the video game champion of the 80s, and was known as the garbage man because of his way to play video games. He then opened his own store to continue his legacy, but we see that he receives a letter that he was going to be evicted because his business was not performing well. Garrett is on his way to a warehouse auction because he wants to get money by selling valuable items. He then starts bidding to win the auction, and we see that he fools the presenter because he had no money. Garrett is excited that there is a valuable video game, but ends up being disappointed because there was only the box, where we can see that there is the Orb of Dominion along with the Crystal of the Earth, because it was actually Steve's room. Garrett is on his way back to his store, but ends up stopping because his car broke down. We are then introduced to siblings Henry and Natalie. They are on their way to move to Tuglas because they want to make a fresh start due to the death of their mother. We go to the city, and now we are introduced to Dawn. She is a real estate agent who sold a house to the siblings, and she has always had a dream of opening her own zoo. In the next morning, the siblings get ready to start their day, and Henry rides off on his bike to get to school. But suddenly we see that he goes to the video game store, and Garrett realizes that he is new in the city. We go to the school, and we see that Henry is in the office with the vice principal Marlene. We then realize that Henry has the intelligence to be an inventor, and that he makes a jetpack to impress his classmates. But suddenly we see that it had been damaged by two of his companions, and that ends up causing it to crash in the factory, where we can see that his sister Natalie works, and that he decides not to call her so she doesn't get in trouble. So he makes the decision that he would ask Garrett for help, and that he would pay him $26 to pretend to be her tutor. We go to the store, and we see that Henry is confused about the problem with his invention. Garrett realizes that he is too creative, and says that he found treasures in the auction warehouses. He then reads instructions they left behind, and says that for no reason should they fuse the materials together. But suddenly we see that they decide to do the opposite, and start being lured into the mine. We go to Natalie, and she says that she is worried because Henry is not answering her. Then Dawn confesses to her that her brother was the responsible for the explosion at the factory, and that they can use GPS to find his location. So they are on their way to meet her brother, and when they arrive, they notice that there is a kind of portal. Henry starts screaming that he is being sucked in, and they end up being teleported because it was too powerful. Then they realize that they are in another dimension, and that everything is made of cubes. The team is being watched by one of the villagers, and we see that he enters the portal because he was curious. While in the underworld, the sorceress is angry because they do not find more gold, and manages to realize that the orb had returned. Malgosha begins to say that the time has come to go to the overworld, and plans to send Steve to get the orb, because she is threatening him with the life of his pet, since he thinks he has been captured. While on Earth, the wolf goes at high speed to return to the overworld. Garrett is thinking that they are in a video game, and that they must talk to the sheep to get new missions. But suddenly we see that it had become night, and they begin to think it was too strange. Then they are attacked by an army of skeletons, and we see that by accident, Garrett falls into a hole, while the other team is running to escape the monsters, and Henry manages to realize that they have special abilities. So he hits the trees to get materials, and starts using them to build a fortress. Garrett starts digging to escape the skeletons, and manages to realize that there is a secret passage. He then decides decides to go out to fight the monsters, but ends up getting hit by the explosion of a creeper. So he runs off to get back to his friends, but we see that by accident, the crystal had been destroyed, and that ends up causing the portal to turn off. Garrett runs off to get to the fortress, but ends up being surrounded by a horde of zombies. Henry opens a door to bring his friend in, and we see that the monsters are getting through because of a creeper explosion. The team begins to think that their end had come, but they are saved by Steve's arrival. We begin to see that Steve is fighting to finish off the zombies, and that he manages to defeat them very easily. Then the monsters disappear because it was already dawn, and Steve asks the team for the location of his pet, because in their hands they have the orb of the domain, and that they can no longer return because they destroyed the crystal. So they decide that they would team up with Steve and give him the orb when he returns them to Earth. While on Earth, the villager was run over by the vice principal of the school, and she invites him to dinner so he won't sue her. We return to the Minecraft world, and we see that Steve had taken the team to a village he built, where we can see that it is inhabited only by villagers, and they make a reference to the legendary Technoblade. Steve starts telling them that they can build objects with the help of their imagination, and that they should not bother the villagers because they are protected by the golem. Then they go to a restaurant that Steve had built with the help of redstone, and he begins to sing his lava chicken song. While in the underworld, the sorceress is informed that she had been betrayed and sends General Chungus to get the orb. Then they use a potion made with netherwort, because thanks to its effect, they could get out of the underworld. We return to the other world, and Steve is saying that they must go to the forest mansion to get another crystal. Natalie is worried about her brother's safety because he's always getting bullied for being too creative, and she ends up scolding him for the explosion he caused. Steve shows them the equipment in his house and says he has everything they need to start their adventure. Garrett opens the chest to see the other items, and we see that he accidentally uses the Ender Pearl. Steve starts telling them that there are crafting tables and that they can use them to create new objects. Henry starts using it with real-world materials, and we see that Steve is surprised that he has been so creative. Garrett tells Steve that he is interested in money and that he would give him the orb in exchange for some diamonds. But suddenly, we see that they begin to be attacked by the Nether Piglins, and they destroy the village to annoy the villagers. Steve realizes that they are seeking the orb and says that General Chungus was his friend in the underworld. Garrett tells the team that he would fight the pig, but we see that he had accidentally hit his friend and that he ends up beating him too easily. While the girls are fighting against the army of piglins and they are defeating them with their teamwork, Garrett was still losing against General Chungus and manages to be saved by the arrival of the golem. They are then attacked by fire from a ghast, and the team decides to split up because they were outnumbered. Steve tells his team that he has elytra wings and that they can use them to escape into the mountains. But suddenly we see that he only had two, and he climbs on Garrett's back so he doesn't crash to the ground. We start to see them speed off to escape the monsters, and then they get separated again because there are too many piglins. Then they start to get closer, to get smaller, and we see them enter through a hole to save themselves from the monsters. Henry uses a rocket to leave at high speed, but ends up crashing because he had lost control. Steve tells his team that he is going to use the bucket, and they manage to save themselves thanks to his water drop. While on Earth, Marlene is having a date with the villager she ran over. We return to the overworld, and Steve starts telling them that the monsters were sent by the queen of the underworld. He then begins to say that Malgosha always dreamed of being a famous dancer, but that she was made fun of because they didn't recognize her talent. So she made the decision that she would stop being creative and that she would use the orb in order to expand her kingdom. He then confesses to the team that they captured his pet and that this was his motivation to return with the orb. The team prepares to continue their mission and says that the forest mansion is behind the mountains. We go to the Nether, and the sorceress is angry because her army has failed, so she makes the decision that she would release the beast and that she would kill General Chungus to make him pay for his failure. While the girls continued on their way to get to the mansion, and we see that Dawn uses a bone to tame a wolf. Suddenly they realize that it was Steve's wolf, and he starts guiding them to reach its owner. We go to the mines, and Steve starts telling them that the redstone material can conduct energy, but suddenly we see that they activated a mechanism and that Garrett is hit by Steve's traps. They then enter a room where he had his diamonds, and Henry realizes that they went to another place because of his greed. Steve realizes that they are about to be attacked by a nether monster, and we see them get on the carts to leave at high speed, but suddenly we see that they run out of power, and when they turn on the torch, they manage to realize that they had been surrounded. Garrett begins to push to escape the monsters, and they manage to get out in time to save themselves from the explosion. Henry begins to claim that he was too selfish because he could have caused them to die in the mine, to which Garrett confesses that he feels like a loser and that he needs the money to get out of bank bankruptcy. We go to the mansion, and Steve tells the team that they would go in to get the crystal to bring them back to Earth. Steve starts telling them about the dangers of the mansion and says they should be careful because there are powerful creatures. Then they start singing to distract the monsters, and we see that Henry takes the opportunity to infiltrate. But suddenly, he realizes that he had been discovered and starts running to hide in the room, where we can see that it was full of chests, and he takes the opportunity to get a weapon, while the other team is getting ready to have a fight. Because Garrett has to fight the chicken jockey, we start to see that he is fighting to try to defeat them, but he was being defeated too easily. Henry realizes the location of the crystal, but suddenly we see that an Enderman appeared and starts attacking him with his mental powers. Henry then attacks him to stop him from bothering him, and we see that he manages to defeat him with the blows of his axe, while Garrett was still being defeated by the team of monsters, and Steve manages to free himself to save his friend. Suddenly, we see that Henry had arrived, and they start running to escape from the mansion. But when they leave, they realize that the sorceress had arrived, and that she uses her powers to get the cube. Then the pigs prepare to use dynamite, and we see that the team manages to get on a ghast to get away from the monsters. Garrett tells his friends that he would stay to distract them, and we see that he decides to sacrifice himself to blow up with the monsters, which ends up causing them to speed off and crash to the ground. When he wakes up, he realizes they had been found, and Steve is happy to be reunited with his pet. While the monsters are using the orb to launch a laser beam, and so the darkness takes over the overworld so they can leave the nether, Steve begins to say that they have to defeat Malgosha, and that they must retrieve the orb to end the darkness. We begin to see that they are following Henry's ideas to prepare for battle, and that they make the best equipment to defend themselves against the piglins. Malgosha tells her army to take over the surface and to destroy the creations that are in their way. Natalie is running to create her army of golems, and Henry uses boots to create a modified one. The golems are on their way to fight the monsters, and they begin to defeat them very easily. Henry begins to fight alongside his sister, and they want to get to the portal to retrieve the orb, while Steve prepares to fight with the sorceress and starts attacking her with his diamond equipment. But suddenly we see that he had missed his attack, and Malgosha hits him to destroy his armor. Henry uses his cannon to launch an ender pearl, and thus reaches the location where the orb is, while Dawn had arrived with an army of wolves, and they start fighting together to distract the pig. But suddenly we see that it wasn't working, and he fires an attack to stop Henry, which ends up causing him to be destroyed by the pig's attack, and he manages to be saved by the arrival of his friend. Garrett begins to tell him that he used the water drop to save himself from the explosion, and that they can use the gas to destroy the tower, with which they get everything back to normal, and the monsters are destroyed because they could not stand the sun. Then the giant pig starts to be attacked by the modified golem, and so the human team gets the orb again. Malgosha tells Steve that he would never be happy because creativity is accompanied by suffering, to which Steve tells her that she is wrong, and that only losers are out for destruction. They then leave on their way back to Earth, and Steve wants to convince Henry to stay on the overworld, to which Henry replies that he doesn't have to worry because he would always be creative no matter the place. Steve starts singing to say goodbye to his pet because he would be on his way back with Dawn. Steve begins to think twice about staying in that world, and he takes the decision that he would return with them. After a while, the friends work together to create a video game, and they say they are living their lives better than they expected. Dawn quit her job to have her own zoo, while Natalie opened her own academy to learn self-defense. Henry showed off his creative skills at school, and we see that he has finally made friends. As a post-credits scene, we see that the vice principal is dating the villager, and that he learned to speak human to ask her to marry him. As a second scene, Steve is on his way back to his old home, and when he arrives, he is greeted by a girl named Alex.
This is how the movie ends. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment on what more movies you would like to see on the channel.